So, hello everybody. Welcome to another XSCALE podcast. Today we're going to talk about SAFe, I'm hesitating, and XSCALE.
They're not mutually exclusive.
I'm joined by Peter Merel, of course, and we're really looking forward to what he has to say and share. Hey, let me address the elephant in the room right away. We're not gonna moving to the dark side, right?
No, we're not moving to the dark side, but at the same time, we're pattern language. We're agnostic. We work well with all of these framework things. That's not to say we are a framework thing. You can use this as a framework, but that's kind of not the recommended usage. I think we need to put all of that into a little bit of context. Maybe if I dive into the deck a little bit, we can do that.
Yeah, that I'm fine with stealing whatever is appropriate, but maybe some context would be nice.
Well, really, we have to begin by avoiding stealing. I don't mind borrowing a little bit of a fair use graphic from Disney, but when it comes to SAFe, we probably have to begin philosophically with the big difference between what we do and what they do. They're very careful about their IP. And so using their IP, adapting it in different ways, particularly if you look at their licensing, if you can be regarded as a competing framework, we don't compete, but they might think that we're competing with them. Anyway, if they regard us that way, then they could do all kinds of awful things to us if we used their graphics. So we don't use their graphics. I borrowed this little choo-choo train from Mike Cohen's beautiful, laughable site where he sends them up awfully. But for the most part, we'll be careful to refer to them. But I don't think that anyone who's listening to this podcast will have not heard of SAFe or not seen their big picture diagrams, and I don't think anybody won't have an experience of them. I'm hoping we'll have John Farrow on this call. John's got all of the certificates, and he's been involved in a couple of very large-scale SAFe implementations, and I'd really love it if we could have someone who's been a bit closer and more recently involved than myself. I've been involved in a couple of SAFe implementations in banks, but I don't have any of the certificates, and I don't intend to get any of the certificates. And I think it's reasonably obvious why I don't. Though if anyone has any questions about that, I'd love to talk about it. On the free and open source stuff, we talked about this in depth, the licensing part of it, in our last podcast. So if anyone has any questions, I'd say listen to that one first. And if you still have questions, we're very, very interested in your questions. But let's not go there. Let's start philosophically with literally the elephant in the room. We don't do the dancing elephant thing. We think that pods of dolphins, which is to say self-directing portfolios of self-managing value streams of self-organizing teams, that's how we build agile organizations. The problem is not scaling agile to the organization, but descaling the organization to agile. And by descaling, we don't mean downsizing. The idea is that there are some simple descaling metrics, the number of people involved in a meeting, obviously, the feedback frequency, and the length, the maximum length of a collaboration loop, the number of middle people between one person and another person who need to collaborate. The deeper your hierarchies, the worse that gets. All of these are problems, really, in organizations. We don't regard them as something to add to agile. We regard them as anti-patterns. We want to produce simple practice patterns that solve them, and that's kind of the starting point for XSCALE. Does that make sense so far, Stefan?
Oh, to me, absolutely. I mean, I think SAFe has become so popular because it's precisely doing the opposite what it's supposed to do. Instead of scaling the organization, it's actually adapting agility to existing organizational structure.
Yes.
And that's why you end up with these fancy but I have to admit, impressive posters, with the release trains and all the arrows and the different hats and roles. And I get it that it's appealing to people who have a more Tayloristic mindset and come from a management perspective. It's safe.
I guess it's in the acronym, yes. If we think of the intent of SAFE as being to take existing organizations and bolt Agile on at the leaves of the trees so that the rest of the trees won't be disrupted, well, SAFE succeeds at doing that, if that is what you call success. But even in doing that, the way that it goes about it has caused a great deal of grief. I think we referred a few podcasts ago to your survey, Stefan, but it bears repeating in this to just quote the numbers.
Yeah, well, I was running a NPS style survey last year about what actually is the NPS value of SAFE, and we ended up with -52. However, the survey was certainly biased to a certain extent because my tribe I was able to share it with is simply a bit more biased against SAFE. So I'm not particularly surprised about the outcome, but the tendency was more revealing because it's not just the survey didn't just comprise of getting this NPS value, but it also provided space to comment on this by the protagonists and the antagonists, and the comments were actually more interesting. So I can we share the link to the post in the show notes.
That's a good idea.
Have a look at that.
Yeah, but for me, what was startling about your survey was that the Scaled Agile people had no answer to it. You would expect they would have gone, oh, no, the numbers are more like this. Look, we did some surveys, and I haven't seen anything like that. There was another telling thing a couple of months ago. I'm trying to remember his name. Oh, he's in my circle. I'll have to refer to him later. But a gentleman went out on LinkedIn, very well connected Agile coach, and asked a simple question. Does anyone know of any developers that like SAFE? And he couldn't find one. So, when we think that Agile is something that began with extreme programming, there were programmers who really liked these ideas, and suddenly all of the programmers have run screaming into the night.
Of course, I'm not surprised by that. Martin Fowler recently wrote a post of why developers should abandon Agile. And I think in general, he was right. And I'm also not surprised that there are no surveys out there from SAFE protagonists that are analyzing the reception of SAFE within an organization, because it's disastrous. And why would you provide data to people who challenge your decision to get SAFE on board of the organization in the first place?
Well, you would do that if you were serious about lean agile. Yeah, but let's not bang on SAFE too much. Look, I think that SAFE solves a very specific set of problems that are very commonplace, and it's been enormously successful at doing that. So the fact that some of our buddies don't like it, well, that's their problem. And really, the point here isn't to say either or, XSCALE or SAFE. It's to say, there are differences. And that means that we can combine these things to get some strengths. We can apply practice patterns where we have a problem or a risk that they solve. And that means we don't need to apply all of XSCALE. We can go into a SAFE deployment and say, well, let's add some of the bits and bobs that we need to get the particular pain points that are being experienced to be solved. So in what we're about to look at, we're trying to look at where there may be pain points we can address. What we do structurally, particularly in the business agility end of things, is based on the Iroquois Confederacy, which is this American Indian civilization that existed for about at least 500 years as a political power. They're still around today. They call themselves the Haudenosaunee, not the Iroquois. That's the European word for them. It's not necessarily a nice word for them. But at their height, there were 1 million people. They governed themselves via treaties. They were completely decentralized, and they had an extraordinarily rich social interconnection structure based on a form of exogamous marriage. They call these things clans. But anyone who starts to dig into this immediately sees that this is an extension of Spotify ideas about tribal society. That these people really did it and really made it work for a very long period of time using a body of knowledge they called the Great Law of Peace. Well, that's what the Europeans translated it as anyway. It was produced by a gentleman named Hiawatha and a couple of other folk, Decanoid and Gigonthese. But most people have heard of Hiawatha if they're into poetry. They've heard there's a lovely long poem by Longfellow called The Song of Hiawatha that has absolutely nothing to do with the historical Hiawatha. You just like the cadence of the name. But anyway, moving away from command and control, you would think would be a natural way to generate an agile organization. When people say, well, I would like to do SAFe and Spotify, which is a very common request from change owners these days, it's really what they're trying to say is that, well, I kind of like the bumplessness of SAFe. I can keep my command and control hierarchy, but I really like all these autonomy ideas in Spotify. Do we have some way of bolting them together? And happily, in XSCALE, we have practice patterns that do indeed allow you to bolt them together. And in particular, there's a set of patterns we call leadership as a service that allow you to keep the command and control roles, but convert them all into servant leaders and actually enforce that change using a simple social protocol of change in the way that decisions are made. Do you buy it, Stefan?
I think you have to put a bit more meat on the bone for others to buy into this idea. And we always have this binary idea. The Roman army was successful because it was because command and control made it prevail on the battlefield. I mean, us, the Celts that were fighting Julius Caesar, right? They certainly didn't lack courage or the willingness to sacrifice themselves for their tribes, but it simply didn't work out. The Roman model was superior. The question is whether we can take this model and just transfer it by 2 millennia into the present, build it on top of Taylorism, and then say, okay, this is the way to go.
It certainly doesn't seem awfully agile. But at the same time, if we look at the Roman Empire, it was enormously successful against tribal societies for a very long time. This is kind of why I pick on the Iroquois, because they're, as a political power, they were around, they were successful, they dominated all of the smaller tribal societies around them for about the same length of time as the Roman Empire, and they're at around about the same scale. But their way of doing business was all based on consensus decision-making and governance by treaty. And these are things that would never have flown anywhere in the Roman Empire. So if they had ever had a chance to come into conflict, it would have been a good question. We can look at the interaction between the Iroquois and the Europeans, because they actually interacted for about 200 years of history, right up until the American War of Independence, when, unfortunately, 3 of the Iroquois nations backed the British and 3 backed the colonials. And the main reason for it was that they didn't have anything in their great law that made provisions for what happens when you've made treaties with an external power and that power splits in two. So I'm not holding up these guys as utopia either. They just have a bunch of very useful practice patterns that worked for a long period of time. But Stefan, let me move on a little bit. Let's go breadth first with this, and then we can come back to specifics. Okay. In SAFe, we have a training framework, and there are a lot of training roles, and there are a lot of roles for all sorts of things. Release train engineers and value stream engineers are the obvious ones, but they really have roles for just about everything. Where what we're trying to do is a learning ecosystem. And the bottom picture, though much less familiar to people who have seen the Agile Manifesto's very gothic, well-lit photo, what we're looking at here is the stand-up that happened at the end of the XP 2000 conference, which was the very first Agile conference in Sardinia. And here we have both Dave Thomas's and Uncle Bob Martin. Martin Fowler took the picture. Alistair Coburn's there. Kent Beck, Ron Jeffries, Eric Gammer and Ralph Johnson, and yours truly. And the nature of this picture, well, it doesn't look like something that would inspire a movement. It looks like what it is, a bunch of geeks going, hey, here's some good ideas. Let's figure some more things out. And that was the beauty of Agile for its first 5 years. There were no certificates. There were no trainers. There was no hierarchy. This was a bunch of people bringing good practice patterns to bear in their respective organizations and eventually finding ways to turn that into a business. But the trouble is that the business took over. Things became very stylized. The top picture comes from the history of Japanese tea, where tea under Rikyu in Japan also started out with this learning ecosystem idea. In fact, that was such a powerful idea that it ended the Sengoku period of civil war, 200 years of civil war in Japan. And so learning ecosystem, Muhin Shu was what it was called, which means no guest and no host. We are interacting as peers to try to enjoy the beauty of a particular scene with a certain well-made cup of tea and the right company, and we can meet across the hierarchy. Information and learning can flow across the hierarchy, and that was the powerful idea that created tea. But in the history of tea, very similar things happened to what happened in the history of Agile. These days, tea is an enormously ritualized, stylized tradition. And the way it's taught has very similar. The Shuhari idea actually comes from tea. It came about 200 years after Muhin Shu. Shuhari is there to defend the training hierarchies and to make certain that the people who own those things can maintain their commercial grip on them. So this is not to say that Shuhari is a bad idea. It's just that without Muhin Shu, we lose the benefit and the essence of it. So with XSCALE Alliance, yes, we have a way of fielding training, but it's in the context of change programs that we are actively coaching, and where we offer training commercially, we offer it in a Linux mode, where we think of training and coaching as very similar to the kinds of services and support that you have in commercial Linux offerings, where the core is free and open source, and that's what we do. So, so this doesn't mean you can't combine XSCALE and SAFe. It just means that their hearts are in different places. Is that a fair summary, Stefan, or too staunch?
No. This is a good one.
Okay, cool. I'll move on. All right. So everyone who thinks about SAFe thinks about the big picture diagram, which is a work of genius. I don't want to take anything away from Leffingwell. You may look at his background in RUP, or you may look at some of the compromises that have been made in SAFe, and I guess we'll talk about a few of them and get a bit further into this. But the go-to-market, the way that he was able to scoop mind share out of what was apparently, or at least it appeared to be 10 years ago, a fairly stable and static market was just astonishing. So I can't show you the SAFe big picture diagram. I can only show you our big picture diagram, which is a lot simpler, but we will try and relate the two. So in learning, which is to say, I hope you can still hear me. Yes?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, good. Sorry, I had a phone call come in, and sometimes that kills my tether. All right. So we have this idea of triple loop learning is that every piece of work that we do should accelerate the flow of value to market. So with Scrum, actually, to tell the truth, XP retrospectives. Retros started in XP, not in Scrum. It, like many things, it just grabbed them and rebranded them in different ways. So in what we do with the second loop that's in the sort of the Scrum logo, that stylized logo with the two loops, we have learning about how to improve workflow, which is the Deming cycle PDCA. It's represented in Lean as well. And a lot of people say, well, that's Agile is just an offshoot of Lean, where they just took PDCA and beefed it up a bit. There's actually an awful lot more to it if we think of it in an XP context. But that's okay for now. None of these ideas exist in a vacuum. They all relate to each other. Anyway, what we want to do with XSCALE is think of a third learning loop, which has to do with maximizing the flow of learnings through the organization. It doesn't do us any good if a squad or a scrum learns something and then doesn't share it. So for them to be able to share it, we have to work on the communication structures and the reward model. You have to have a way to share it, and you have to have a motivation to share it. So we move beyond Scrum of Scrums into chapters and councils, the representative councils, rotating representatives, and we get these ideas partly from the Iroquois. And then on the reward model end, we work with open book management ideas and throughput accounting. And we'll go into a little bit more detail on those as we go along. But anyway, the idea is that we can localize these three learning loops. At a stream level, we're worrying about the flow of value to market. At a squad level, we're worrying about workflow. And at a portfolio level, we have to worry about the flow of learnings through the organization. And there are metrics for these things. And by focusing on them and mapping them onto the organization structures, it means that we have a very tight cadence on our feedback loops to try and maximize these flows. So if work accelerates flow of value, learning accelerates workflow. So learning flow is anything we can do to increase learning flow is critically important to developing an agile organization. Well, I did say we'd try and make this look a little bit safe-like. So here we've got, you could think, if you're thinking in safe terms, we have a bunch of communities of practice. If you were thinking in Spotify terms, you could think of them as chapters. We think of them as chapters. And we also have these vertical column-y things that are intended to represent value streams. We think about squads and streams and portfolios. We don't worry about programs, because really what we want is to split products up into epics and then assign responsibility for those epics to particular structures of squads. Now, it looks here like we've got distinctions between some squads that are more businessy and some squads that are more DevOpsy and some squads that are more delivery-ish. But actually what we've got here is a set of overlapping relationships using chapters and councils, so that we have everybody is always represented at a portfolio level and at a stream level. And when it comes to what we do with DevOps, we take care of the relationships explicitly. But what we do with this model, this is not our big picture. This is a model that's intended to show some of the ways that we can map these ideas onto SAFe. Obviously, this is not the SAFe big picture, but it's much closer to it than the one with all of the curly whirlies we looked at just before. So to answer the question about can we combine SAFe and Spotify, and do we have practice patterns that do exactly that, this is our picture for that, but it's not a prescription. You don't have to look like this. This is an example, an exemplar of applying the practice patterns in XSCALE to be able to adapt these different ways of working. Does it make sense so far, Stefan?
Absolutely.
Cool. Do you have anything else you'd like to add structurally to what we're doing?
Not at the moment.
Okay, cool. So, business agility. Now, I confess that I had a small drama with my laptop earlier today. So we're about to see the last of the pretty graphics, and then we're just going to have text. And well, life's like that. But I will get the complete deck up if anyone who would like to see the whole thing. You can look at it and you'll hear the words. It'll mean the same. Okay, so cost accounting. what's that got to do with Agile? What's that got to do with SAFe? Surely we don't have anyone in SAFe who's worrying about the cost accounting. I guess we have some financials who worry about it. This portfolio visualization comes out of Rally. I'm assuming that it's okay to use a Rally screen. I don't imagine they have quite so restrictive licensing on that. Well, anyway, that doesn't look very much like the bottom picture, because the bottom picture is building on Goldrat's ideas around throughput accounting, where in throughput accounting, we think that there are two different kinds of operating expense. The good kind, which funds the capability to generate net profit, and the not so good kind, which is the stuff where there's nothing that we can do except try to minimize it, try to control it. So in Goldrat's ideas of throughput accounting, we don't say that we want to minimize operating expense across the board. It's not about lean cost cutting. There's no Six Sigma in it. The entire intent is to say, well, we expect we're going to fund our capability to generate net profit from net profit. So that kind of operating expense is good. If we add net profit and operating expense together after we've taken out the truly variable costs, we want to maximize that net profit plus operating expense. We call that throughput, which from a cost accounting point of view is heresy. All right, coming back to SAFe. In SAFe, we have burn up charts and burn down charts and cumulative flow diagrams and the usual stuff. Everybody in Agile is used to those things. But the trouble with those representations is that they only talk about the components of operating expense. So where we try to deal with the wibbles and wobbles in what we track, we are not dealing with the components of throughput. And to give you an idea about what a difference this makes, 2014, Barnes & Noble had a net profit of $100 million and an operating expense of about $300 million. And that might sound quite respectable to you. But we compare them with Amazon in the same year. Net profit of also $100 million, operating expense of over $10 billion. Well, pretty obviously, you'd rather be Amazon. And you don't get to be Amazon by single-mindedly trying to reduce operating expense. So that maximization of throughput is critically important. And unfortunately, it's not represented in, well, any of the Agile methods I know about except for XSCALE. So on the SAFe end of things, the reason that Rally stole a march over Jira a few years ago was because it had much better portfolio management capabilities, which was really about supporting PMO and ePMO and boards and so on with the kinds of time and dollar figures they needed to be able to fit into their traditional cost accounting models. So that's not to say that those models are bad or inappropriate for their purpose. But if we're going to make Agile organizations throughput accounting, this Amazon way of looking at the world, we need that. So we have to reconcile the two, and we do in XSCALE. Shall I move on, Stefan?
Yes, please.
Okie doke. All right. This is where I've run out of graphics, so I feel bad, but not very bad, because hopefully we can keep it up with hand waving. There are many roles and responsibilities in SAFe, and there are KPIs that go with these things. There is another school of thought about reward models called open book management. It comes from mainly two gentlemen, Jack Stack and John Case. There are plenty of books about this. There have been articles as recently as last year in Forbes magazine about it. The whole idea is we would like to motivate people by giving them some percentage of the top line of the portfolio, or possibly of the whole organization, as their bonus. They don't motivate them by rewarding them on the basis of some individual KPI. This eliminates a huge amount of game theoretics. Now, I think that actually that game theoretic aspect, Stefan, should be the subject of our next XSCALE podcast, if it's okay with you, because we haven't done one on that yet.
Yeah, that would be great, particularly because individual incentives always tend to create misalignment with teams, etc. PP.
Exactly. Yes. We'll talk about the evolution of trust and the tragedy of the PMO and so on in our next podcast. But the beautiful thing about this open book stuff is that it gives very simple, very straightforward ways of incentivizing that work from organizations all the way from a startup to, I think the largest exemplar of it is General Dynamics, which became a wholly employee-owned organization about 20 years ago using open book management. Under, I think it was John Case, but anyway, inspired by that stuff. We're talking about organizations that have been very stable, highly successful over long periods of time. So this is no longer experimental, but it doesn't seem to fit into the SAFe view of the world. We have plenty of stuff in SAFe that's about identifying the responsibilities per role so that we can identify KPIs so that we can go with the traditional reward models. So again, this is not to say that you have to do open book management to do XSCALE. These are patterns. You apply them when you're experiencing a problem or a risk that they solve, as opposed to the framework where you have to use the whole thing. Okay. And that brings us to the different change models we've got. In SAFe transformations, you basically parachute change agents of various stripes into every level of the organization, and you try to get everything to change up front. And that doesn't necessarily work very well. To give a concrete exemplar of this, and there are no shortage of them to pick on, there's an organization called Express Scripts International, ESI, in the US. And I happen to know a little bit about its history from some conversations that I don't need to go into the conversation. Suffice to say, this is a 70,000 person organization that embarked on a SAFe transformation several years ago. And about 2 or 3 years ago, they finally chucked SAFe out. That they had invested very heavily in it for multiple years. They wound up with a situation that is still very far from the kinds of things we would think of as an agile organization. I can't share too many details about what's going on in there. But suffice to say that there are many banks, there are many telcos, there are many organizations around the world that have had multi-year engagements in trying to get these transformations to happen and have failed miserably. And now, is it their fault? Is it the fault of the change agents? Is it the fault of SAFe? I don't think it's the fault of any of those things. I think the fault lies in the model of change that has come to be the norm in all parts of the agile industrial complex. And the model of change that is applied is this idea of pushing the new culture into the organization, getting everybody to change at once. You know, the old Starship adage about everybody fights, nobody quits, and if you don't do your job, I'll shoot you. That's actually a mindset that many senior managers bring into these things. And it's apart from the fact that it makes everybody act on the basis of fear, which destroys trust relationships across the board, and also loses a lot of the people who are promoted into the middle management because of their competence and their cleverness and their wisdom. The fact is, most of the time, these transformations get stuck halfway. And the disruption that comes with them is dreadful, the cost is enormous, and they take years and years and years. We have a model of transformation that takes a few months and can actually be done fixed price, where the idea is we cherry pick the change champions from the organization. Design, delivery, DevOps, the executive. If we've got some progressives in PMO or EPMO, that'd be great too. But we almost always have an easy time finding progressive business folk. So we hook these change champions together in just a few of them, like a dozen, maybe 20. Doesn't matter whether you've got a multi-thousand person organization. We hook these things together into uncompromised agile value streams. We coach them so that we can prove using metrics that they're working reliably, they're working fast. And once that steel thread of capability is mature, which takes not that long. We're talking about not many people. They're all change champions. We don't have to worry about anyone who's resistant to change. maybe 3, maybe 4 months. And even that might be a bit long for some people. Once it's working like that, great. These people are going to be our change leaders for the next iteration of change, the next increment of change. And so what we do with that, we split that initial value stream right down the middle, and we backfill with the people who have trust relationships with those change champions. So these people who are joining each of the two halves to make two whole value streams, well, they're learning by immersion, not by instruction. And it's as if you were learning French by going to France rather than trying to pick up a book about it. So by splitting and doubling, we are growing capability exponentially. We can combine that with a breadth-first approach. Lean Kanban's breadth-first approach works very well with this. There's lots of ways of bringing these self-propagating transformation ideas and combining them with things that can add value to even the most conservative Taylorist waterfall programs. And we did that in a bank in Australia called the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. From 2011 to 2014, I was strategist and principal coach in that transformation, and they are still agile today. So in terms of culture change, that's become a poster child for agile in Australia. There were a few folk at different points that tried to get SAFe into the mix, but it never stayed up. However, there were many other frameworks, usually bespoke ones, that CBA has flirted with since then. But this idea of self-propagating transformation, it actually started in a transformation that I ran at IAG back in 2010 in the BTS group. So we've used this in a number of organizations around the world now, and it's much lower risk. It's much cheaper, much more effective. And when you run these things, it's difficult to say what better means. But according to the metrics that we keep, it's better. So that's to say, if we look at the whole thing up front, we could even claim it was safer. But let's not go there. Again, this is not to say you shouldn't use the SAFe patterns. We could use self-propagating transformation with SAFe and simply take all of the expense and worry out of the damn thing and get results that we can use in a period of months rather than years. Now, that's not to say that the SAFe scaled agile people would like us to do that. They'd probably find that that was taking a little bit of their dinner away. We don't want to do that. Now, product management, breadth first versus depth first. Well, I should let Stefan get a word in edgewise. What do you think so far, Stefan?
Well, appealing to me. I don't know whether it's appealing to the SAFe folks or any other protagonist from the agile industrial complex, because if you like to sell material, it's probably not so interesting, because it's a small team, special forces versus the full organized army, with months of planning ahead and then rolling out something. So I understand that they're opting for the first option, so to speak.
Oh, I completely agree with you, and even more so when we think about the big four consultancies that are now acquiring middle-sized agile consultancies. That was a Freudian slip. Hand over fist. We have so many of these. What we thought of as big firms are actually little firms compared to the Deloittes and Accentures of the world, and they're getting snapped up because business agility has become this word that can be used to mean almost anything. We use it to refer to the communication structures, the reward models, and the change models that generate uncompromised, self-directing portfolios of self-managing streams, etc. So we've got concrete meanings for this word, but that's not to say that people shouldn't be making their money if they can get away with it. Certainly not knocking capitalism. It's just that the business models that we're interested in working with are all about mutual benefit and not about relationships that are exploitative.
We're certainly still in the skimming phase of the market.
Yeah. As to whether we're going to be successful at that, so we're using Linux as our model, as our business model. Well, it might be that we'll fall flat on our faces. Maybe this Linux model doesn't work in the agile world, but I can't see why it can't. And so far, we seem to be growing at a nice rate. And with some of the offerings we're about to announce, I think we're going to accelerate that. So, but we are an ecosystem of independence. We're never going to be the big Accenture, much less CA or ThoughtWorks. We're not. That's not our model. We want to provide the picks and shovels to all of the independent coaches and consultancies of the world, so that they can go out. And that's where self-propagating transformation, because it's quicker and better and cheaper and safer, is a wonderful thing for independents to be able to bring to their clients. Now, product management. This was actually historically where XSCALE began. There was a program in Commonwealth Bank of Australia called Kaching that had a very troubled product management experience for its first release or two. And we had to invent a number of patterns, a number of practices, they weren't patterns yet, to be able to sort that out. And these practices for product management are all around doing it breadth first. So if we think that agile delivery is kind of a hill climbing method, we're adding one feature at a time to an existing base of features to develop our product. Well, what happens if the product we want to develop is actually not very marketable, and we need to jump from the click wheel iPod to the iPhone? Well, we're not going to get from here to there just by adding a few incremental features. That was kind of how Nokia came unstuck with their product line. So to be able to map out the market as an ecosystem and design solutions breadth first into that ecosystem, we adapt BDD for this purpose, amongst other things. And the methods we use build on design thinking and set-based design and emergent design, but the fundamental is we want to be able to make distinctions on design space breadth first, so that we can find the global maximum of impact. And doing that allows us to get much better product market impact than if we're just trying to climb up the nearest foothill when there's an Everest right next door. We have to be able to find Everest. Now, the other advantages of doing this thing breadth first, and we need to talk about 3D Kanban a little bit at some stage, but we don't have diagrams of that here. That's all right. This gives us an enormous economy on the artifacts that we keep for our work breakdown structure, rather than having to build gigantic PI walls and lots of red string. I don't know if they even do red string anymore, to tell the truth. But anyway, there's lots of things that are story level, and story level estimates, and story point estimates, and WSGIF priorities, and things that are really statistically smeared to make any kind of decision about release planning. We don't break epics down into features until we need to be able to plan to hit a particular kind of a release goal. Our release goals are all about opening market bottlenecks. So we don't break the features down into stories until we're ready to deliver the feature. That means we have to prioritize features and budget for them. And that makes an awful lot more sense than trying to prioritize stories from multiple different features, because when you take stories from multiple different features and intersperse them, well, it takes longer to deliver each feature. And really, all you want to do is prioritize at a feature level. Now, SAFe applies WSGIF at a feature level as well. The trouble with WSGIF, apart from the statistical smearing, is that the math doesn't add up. You're dividing urgency by job size. And there's nothing that says that makes any sense. So there's nothing wrong with Reinertsen's ideas of cost of delay, but the math for WSGIF is a bit addled. So what we do when we're trying to do this breadth first estimation prioritization at a feature level, we're very interested in first understanding the return we're expecting, the relative business value, and then the absolute budget per feature that we think we're going to need. We don't have to get it right, because we continuously improve our estimates and our prioritizations. We don't do a PI planning meeting to try and get everything perfectly lined up at a story level and then let them all go and conquer. Instead, we're trying to get a very economical vision of a release plan that we can improve as we go and take all of the measurements we're making and bring them back to our breadth first understanding of the world so that we can improve that. And that gives us an ability to pivot much more dynamically than you can do in any of the traditional agile product management. We don't have product owners, we have product squads. I think I'm getting a bit ahead of myself with this stuff. Let's talk about big room planning and product squads. What's wrong with big room planning, Stefan?
All various things that come to my mind, but please go on.
Oh, okay. All right, I'll be brave about it if you won't. It's an exercise in command and control. We have Scrum of Scrums used as an excuse to build a decision-making hierarchy. And the people who are in the individual teams, everything that they do and say gets filtered through that hierarchy. So the fact that we have the entire IP sprint beforehand for all of these little squads, scrums, whatever you want to call them, to get their heads together, to get their inputs to the PI planning ready to roll. That doesn't mean that what they're doing is going to generate good decisions when everything has to wind up in the lap of the hippos in the room. In some Australian banks, there are PI planning meetings with 1,400 people involved. So when you have rooms like that, there's no way that anything but power is going to dominate the decision making. To re-invoke Hagbard Cellini's second law of communication, accurate communication only happens between equals, and that means we have to have both a small number of people in the room, and we have to have them there on a regular basis so that we can, very regular, I mean, daily or weekly cadences, not 3 months, so that they have the game theoretics ironed out. We will go into more depth in this next week, so that they can see eye to eye. So if we're talking about a product squad of somewhere between 6 and 12 people, and if they're meeting, they're doing stand-ups and they're doing weekly meetings, and that's actually how we focus on what's the next feature to deliver for this value stream. We don't have to worry about bringing it all back to some gigantic command and control exercise. Instead, we use mission command. Well, that's where we are able to get much better disciplined, much more focused, much more adaptive agile product management than what we get in a SAFe. Now, that said, there's no reason you can't combine these things. If we were to think that the big room planning is a kind of a showcasing exercise, there's nothing wrong with it there, well, then we have guild meetings very similar to what's done in Spotify. We can do those in big rooms. We can do open spaces in big rooms. But when we require the big rooms to make the decisions for us, when we stop the autonomy of the squads and the streams, and if we're talking about Dunbar-sized limited portfolios, those things need to have autonomy to make the different kinds of decisions. Without that, well, we will wind up with shambolic decisions being made for political purposes, and that's what we see over and over again in these big rooms.
Which is the typical social dynamic in these kind of groups, right?
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of what SAFe defends. It doesn't challenge those dynamics. So, in a lot of the agile world, we have these things called backlogs. And in SAFe, we make whole big, gigantic portfolio. No, what do they call those increments these days? PIs, not product increments anymore. We're planning increments of some sort. Anyway, I wish we did have John Farrow on this one. He would set me right with that, but that's okay. Anyway, the problem with having all of these backlogs of stories, of breaking all the features down to stories and then doing your planning at that level, you're violating one of the most fundamental agile principles there is. It comes out of extreme programming. It's called, you aren't going to need it. YAGNI. If we have planned all of these stories out and we've assigned them to sprints and we're expecting people to commit to these stories in these sprints, Well, what happens when we learn something and discover that we don't need those stories? We need some different stories. We don't need those features. We need some different features. If we only make those decisions once a quarter, that's not awfully agile. Really, when you look at the Agile Manifesto, we're supposed to be trying to move our decision making to very tight cadences. There are principles that back this in the manifesto, a preference for the shorter time frame. We have an ability to make these decisions on shorter time frames. So when we take decisions and delegate them to the hippos in the room, or the elephants, when we do that, we violate a lot of the things that make Agile work in the first place. So with 3D Kanban, we've got a very simple way to composite the different kinds of entities that are involved in a self-directing portfolio, by which I mean the business drivers and constraints, the epic landscape, the release plan of features. And then as we take each feature, hand it to a feature delivery squad, along with BDD acceptance criteria and metrics, and we say to that squad, there, you can break that down into stories. If you discover that the budget we assigned, time budget we assigned for that feature is too short, then bring that learning back to us, because we are very interested in adjusting our release plan to account for it. So the idea that we are doing stream funding, we are delivering products, we are continuously trying to maximize product market impact and business throughput for the portfolio as a whole, and we are all motivated to do that by a reward model that that means that we actually have motivation to collaborate in this way as peers. And we have some decision-making protocols that allow us to do that. Well, this 3D Kanban thing provides us with the concrete representation of the resulting work breakdown structures. Did I miss anything, Stefan?
Not so far, although the information density is getting higher, which I fully understand because we're almost an hour live.
Yeah. So look, let's wrap it up relatively quickly.
Perfect.
I'd like to take a few questions at the end if we have time. Okay. So on DevOps, well, so I think actually we're very well aligned with Scrum on DevOps. I really like Scrum DevOps. I think it's missing a few things, and sorry, I should say Safe DevOps, not Scrum DevOps. Scrum XP being the basis for delivery in Safe, it does represent some problems because it compromises on the way that XP is actually supposed to work. If you look, for example, at what Safe says about refactoring, it says that refactorings are pieces of work that are supposed to be estimated and prioritized along with the rest of the work. So the idea of merciless refactoring to flatten the cost of change curve is fundamental to XP is just thrown out. So I guess you can call it Scrum XP, but it's not the same thing as actual XP. Plus, it's got all of the Scrum roles that don't work very well. Product owners and Scrum Masters, I don't think it's heresy anymore to say that most of the time, these are roles that people acquire for the sake of their careers. They have no necessary aptitude for these roles. They don't understand how to do servant leadership. And we get all kinds of behaviors out of Scrum that don't look very much like what anyone would think of as a high-performing, self-organizing, agile team. So bolting Scrum XP together as a brand name, that's not the same thing as actual XP. And some of the original XP aficionados have been extremely critical of Safe because of this. Well, when we get into DevOps, as we have just done in Safe in April of this year, they've also taken some liberties. The Safe version of DevOps has this idea of continuous exploration, continuous integration, continuous deployment, except the continuous deployment is actually deployment to staging, not to production. Continuous integration, well, they're not too firm about what you do with your quality automation, so I guess you certainly can do it properly. It doesn't stop you doing it properly. Continuous exploration seems like it's kind of tacked on. we're in the Phoenix project, Gene Kim, 3 ways vision of DevOps. We have an integration of all these feedback loops, and we try to tighten them up. In CE, CI, CD, these things get split apart by the agile release train. And of course, they have to mix it, and they come out of agile release trains because that's the fundamental for Scrum. But the more you move into DevOps, even Scrum DevOps, the more tension there is against the way the rest of SAFe. Sorry, did I say Scrum? I meant SAFe. The more tension there is against the way the rest of SAFe works. Scrum doesn't assume agile release trains. I'm going to keep going, Stefan.
Yeah, I'm just smiling while listening to you. It's okay. Go on.
Okay. All right. So PIs and release trains, we talked about some of the problems there, but the fundamental idea in XSCALE is that we are continuously refactoring our release plans. And we're doing this on daily and weekly cadences. And where the pedal hits the metal is something called BDD, which I think most people listening will have some understanding of, and something called B2D2, which we did a podcast on a couple of months ago now, where the intent is to take the quality automation and convert it into a field of qualitative analytics that we can use as input through data science to our product management decision making. None of that's in SAFe at all. So in general, the ability to make these decisions scientifically on very rapid cadences, that's not what SAFe is intended to do. But it doesn't say you can't do that. So the notion I think I want to wind up with is you can combine SAFe and XSCALE just fine. But don't feel that the result has to take all of SAFe or all of Scrum or all of XP or all of anything on board. Doing this purely agnostically, tailoring it to the exact business domain and change context for the organization you're working with, that's going to get much better results than taking any framework, including XSCALE as a framework, into your client. I reckon I have gassed on for far longer than I should have, Stefan. So why don't we open the floor to any questions that people might have?
Yeah, Gideon is asking, what metrics do we use to show this steel thread is working?
So I think there's a long conversation we can have on that, but the basics of this, we talked about workflow, or work as a way to accelerate value flow, and learning as a way to accelerate workflow. That suggests that if we keep these throughput diagrams in the form we were looking at earlier, and I know we didn't go into any real detail on it, we need to, we can use some calculus to figure out a representation of improvements to workflow and improvements to learning flow. And we can also apply the pirate metrics to learning as a product delivered to the organization as a market. And those metrics all come with simple ways of devising analytics that inform them. So longer conversation, I think we should probably do a podcast just on that one by itself.
Fair enough. Gideon has another question. Does Spotify still use chapters and guilds? Evan Laban was saying that they are working differently from years ago.
That's a really good question. I would love to know the answer to that. I know a few people who were involved early on in Spotify, and I do believe that the Nyberg stuff describes an agility a la Spotify that came out about 2013. I think the way that they represented themselves then is very true. But I think they, as I understand it, they still emphasize autonomy. But whether they keep the same structures is a good question. I don't know. Back in them days, they used to have a management hierarchy, product management hierarchy, and business management hierarchy. They didn't attempt to do the kind of representative councils that we do for product squads and portfolio councils. So, and they didn't have leadership as a service, and they didn't have DRIs, and a lot of the things that we do to make these things work reliably. So I would love it if Spotify would come out and say, well, here's what we do today. I haven't seen any of that. And if anyone does, please drop me a line. I'd love to know more about where they're up to.
I certainly would like to know that too. We'll see.
Cool. Yeah, maybe we can get some guests. It would be wonderful to talk about, rather than Safe versus XScale, Spotify versus XScale. But we will need some guys who actually have been in there recently so that we can talk about it properly.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Cool.
So, any more questions?
Might be a stopping point, Stefan.
Sounds to me. Peter, thanks a lot. Perfectly, exactly 60 minutes.
Oh, well, that wasn't so bad. I thought we were hitting the 90. Let me go back to a beautiful picture at the start, just so that we can sort of cap it off with, oh, no, I can't even get to the damn thing. That's the wonders of morph transformation transitions in PowerPoint. So never mind. We'll stop there. All good, mate.
Okay.
Okay. See you next time, and we will talk about the game theoretics of agile organizations then.
Yeah, that would be great. Good point.
All
Awesome.
right. Take care,
Thanks a
Stefan.
lot.
Take care.